Good evening. Sorry to interrupt your conversations. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a real treat to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater this evening. Tonight, we're honored to have Jonathan Sarna and Stephen Roberts join us as they discuss Sarna's latest work, Lincoln and the Jews, A History. A book signing will follow tonight's program. Before we begin, let me tell you about two programs coming up here in the McGowan Theater, and will also be broadcast on our YouTube channel if you can't be here in person. On Tuesday, May 12th at 7 p.m., Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Joseph Ellis will discuss his new book, The Quartet, Orchestrating the Second American Revolution. It's the story of the four men most responsible for creating the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights: Washington, Jay, Hamilton, and of course, Madison. And on Thursday, May 21st at 7, we will go behind the scenes of the HBO series Boardwalk Empire. HBO recreated the realism and texture of the Prohibition-era Atlantic City for Boardwalk Empire. Video clips and stories from those in front of and behind the camera will help tell the backstory of this popular series. If you want to know more about these and all of our programs and exhibitions, please refer to our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it online or in the regular mail. Another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our work in education and outreach programs. There are applications for membership in the lobby also. And a little-known secret that I keep telling people about: no one has ever been turned down for membership in the Foundation. Tonight's discussion centers on an exhibit of the same name which opened at the New York Historical Society this past March, marking the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War and Lincoln's assassination. This exhibit focuses on the significant relationships and efforts between Lincoln and his Jewish friends and associates during his political career. Herb Geldod wrote in the Jewish World Review that Lincoln was the first American president to become officially involved in questions of Jewish equality when he urged Congress to change the chaplaincy laws to permit rabbis to become military chaplains. When General Ulysses S. Grant issued General Order Number 11, barring Jews as a class from all territories under his control because he suspected they were smuggling cotton, President Lincoln rescinded it immediately. The book highlights many Lincoln letters, photographs, and artifacts, including a few documents from the National Archives, such as the June 13, 1864 nomination by Lincoln to the U.S. Senate of Louisa Jonas to be postmastress of Quincy, Illinois. Louisa Jonas was the widow of Abraham Jonas, who was a good friend and political ally of Lincoln. And the Treasury warrant, dated April 5, 1861, for Lincoln's monthly salary as president. He wrote to the Secretary of the Treasury and insisted that on the 5th day of each month, please do send a warrant for the amount of my salary as President of the United States. And as he had been inaugurated on March 4th, he did not want to be paid for 4 days of the month he had not yet assumed office. A great example of his honest Abe reputation. Our partner for tonight's program is the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington. And I know that there are many members here, so thank you for being here. The director of the society and its Lillian and Albert Small Jewish Museum for the past 21 years is Laura Cohen Applebaum. The museum is the steward for the historic 1876 Addis Israel Synagogue, a few blocks from here. Under Laura's leadership, the museum has played a growing role in preserving and presenting the important role of the Jewish community that the Jewish community has played in metropolitan Washington. Please welcome the director, Laura Cohen Applebaum. Thanks for being here.
You might see that I'm hobbling a little bit. And I was going to say a little bit of the backstory. I don't want to bore you too much because we have our main attraction. But there was a strange confluence of events on the day, April 16th, that I hurt my foot. I was on my way here to the National Archives, and I was coming for Harold Holzer's noontime talk. I often come over for noontime talks. It was about the assassination of the president. And the day before had been, of course, as the archivist mentioned, the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's death. So I was crossing 6th Street, and I heard a marching band. So I turned and looked, and I saw twirlers. And it dawns on me, it's Emancipation Day here in the district. This is the day that commemorates the freeing of the slaves in the District of Columbia, April 16th, 1862. So this was 8 months, as you know, before the Emancipation Proclamation. So because I'm headed to the lecture on the assassination, already through my mind, I'm thinking of Dr. Charles Lieberman, who was a Jewish immigrant and president of the Medical Society, called to Lincoln's bedside on that fateful night when he was shot. And I'm wondering, what was the good doctor thinking at that bedside? Because I know that 3 years earlier, when the slaves were emancipated, his 3 slaves were among those that were emancipated. And he was paid for those slaves because in D.C. there was a compensated emancipation. So Dr. Lieberman is illustrated among those in Lincoln's circle, and you'll be able to see that on the first pages of this wonderful new book that brings us here tonight, Lincoln and the Jews. He was one of about 2,000 Jewish residents in the city who interacted with the president. And you might be able to recognize others like the lawyer Simon Wolfe, the stationeer Adolfo Solomons. I know many of the items in the collection here at the archive bear his watermark because he was the stationeer to the White House and to Congress, and Lincoln's colorful chiropodist, Issachar Zachary. And they're also in our city and in the new volume. And so you'll learn a little bit about them on the pages in here tonight, I'm sure, too. So the irony of Lieberman being a slaveholder, being called 3 years later to Lincoln's bedside, maybe makes me walk a little too excitedly, and I fractured my foot on the way over. So last month, the New York Historical Society opened a wonderful new exhibition displaying most of the material in the book, and I wanted to tell you about that because it closes on June 7th, and then Dr. Sarna told me it will go to Springfield, Illinois, and then to LA. So you'll see much of the material from the exhibit in the book. On behalf of our board of directors at the Jewish Historical Society, I want to thank the archivist and the staff, especially Susan Clifton, for partnering with us again this year for Jewish American Heritage Month. Tonight is somewhat of an encore presentation, as both our participants spoke together back in 2012, as you heard before, when Dr. Sarna's book, When Grant Expelled the Jews, first was published. And that's a whole other story, as you know. And you might know, those of you who know us well, that the historic synagogue that we preserve was kind of notable because President Grant attended its dedication on June 9th, 1876, maybe as a gesture to the Jewish community for his expulsion order during the Civil War. I'm honored to introduce tonight's speakers. Dr. Jonathan Sarna is a leading expert of American Jewish history, and he's the Jonathan H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University. Dr. Sarna also serves as the Chief Historian of the National Museum of Jewish History in Philadelphia, and he's president of the Association of Jewish Studies. That's an organization that promotes teaching of Jewish studies at colleges and universities. He's written and edited more than 20 books, including American Judaism, which received the Jewish Book Council's Jewish Book of the Year Award. Dr. Sarna is a friend and a mentor. He served on our NEH panels, and he advises us on the content of our work. Dr. Sarna will be in conversation with Stephen V. Roberts. Steve is well known in DC circles. He's a best-selling author, longtime journalist, political commentator, and the J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro, I think it's Shapiro. Those are important names in D.C. Jewish history. Professor of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. He's co-authored several books with his wife, Cokie Roberts, including Our Haggadah, Uniting Traditions for Interfaith Families. And among his other books are From the Ends of the Earth, 13 Families and Their New Lives They Made in America. It's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Sarna and Steve Roberts to the stage.
Well, thank you so much. We're, Dr. Sarna and I are delighted to be with you all again. I think this is the third year in a row I've done this event for the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington. The second time we've had the privilege of talking with you about a wonderful new book. This is, by the way, it will be available for signing. the heft of this book reminds me of a story when I was a young writer here in Washington, and I was in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, and Hedrick Smith, the bureau chief, had written this massive tome about Washington, and he was talking to Russell Baker, the very witty columnist of the New York Times, and Hedrick Smith said to Russell Baker, "Russ, I just read your new book. I couldn't put it down." And Russell said, "I saw your book, Rick. I couldn't pick it up." And so, but this is worth picking up. So, but make sure you do it with both hands. This is, as I say, Susan and Laura mentioned, a book that documents a little-known history. Just when you thought you couldn't learn anything more about Abraham Lincoln, it turns out that you can. I wanted to start the conversation, Dr. Sarna, by a context, putting in context. One of the most interesting things you say right in the beginning is that Abraham Lincoln's life spanned a very important period in American Jewish history, because when he was born in 1809, there were, I think you said, 3,000 Jews in America. By the time of his death, there were 150,000. Right. So set us the context. Who were those Jews in America? Where were they from? Where were they living?
So there is a significant migration of Jews from Central Europe, the countries that are today Germany and Poland and so on, that come to the United States in the 19th century. Some of them, the ones most likely to support Abraham Lincoln, were 48ers. They had supported liberal revolutions in Central Europe in 1848. Then they had fled.
Yes, not a particularly healthy thing to be doing.
No, and they paid for it by having to leave and come to America. And they continue. They bring to America those values which had led them to support revolution. And those were the people most likely to oppose slavery, to support the Republican Party. But there also are lots of other people who come from Central Europe who simply come for reasons of opportunity, and every community really begins to have a sense that there are now non-Christians living there, meaning that in 1809, most of the Jews live in port cities from Savannah, say, to Newport. Savannah, Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, Newport, and so on. Baltimore. By 1850, Jews have spread all the way across the country, literally to California with the gold rush, and they have filled in lots of places. And, of course, Abraham Lincoln has met them long before he comes to Washington, because you had clothing stores in
What a
Illinois.
surprise, Jews running clothing stores.
Exactly, astonishing.
I know. I told you to learn a lot of new things tonight, right?
And but you didn't know that it's the ancestor of the folks who began Sears Roebuck.
Sears and Roebuck,
yeah.
But you know, one of the things you mentioned, though, once Lincoln gets to Illinois and Springfield, there are Jewish merchants like the Hamaslogs. But in Kentucky, in his youth, you posit that he probably never did meet a Jew during his childhood.
Yeah, exactly. No evidence of Jews in those areas, and they were so poor. It's unlikely a Jewish peddler would have bothered to go in that area. So the Jews Abraham Lincoln knows in those days are the Jews in the Bible. But in the second half of his life, he interacts with numbers of Jews, and he has Jewish friends, which I think is significant. You have Jewish friends, it gives you a sense that these are folks like anybody else.
Right, on a more personal basis. And you started to talk about Julius Hammerslau, is that how you pronounce his name? Who ran a clothing store in Springfield. And even his obituary, he was described as a warm friend, as you quote in the book. But there is that interesting, sorry I interrupted you, but you were telling the story about how there actually is a connection between this clothing store in Springfield and the Sears and Roebuck empire. Which
I mean, and that these Hammerslaws, and they're related to Myers, and the store is sold to the Rosenwalds, and of course it's Rosenwald, the next generation, that creates Sears Roebuck. So you do see these fascinating connections, but what...
And you think that it's probably likely that Abe Lincoln actually bought clothing from this store? And
it does seem likely that Lincoln bought clothing from Hammerslaw, and of course Hammerslaw does extremely well in the Civil War when he gets, he's a clothing manufacturer by then, and he gets contracts for to clothe uniforms for lots of troops, which was extremely lucrative. And I think that Lincoln, there's good evidence that he knew Henry Rice and so on. But what's really important is his friendship with Abraham Jonas. Hammerslaw, after all, is 23 years younger than Lincoln, and Rice is again much younger. But Jonas is somebody whom he really calls my friend. They spent a lot of time together. They're both lawyers. They're both politicians. Jonas, I think, has been unduly neglected.
And Jonas himself was a member of the Illinois legislature.
Right, exactly. Politicians.
You're probably one of the first Jews to serve in a state legislature anywhere, I would guess.
And for a lot of people, he was probably the first Jew that they really knew. He was very significant in Quincy, Illinois, where he lived. Most of the people who write about Jonas note the fact that he is Jewish. Meaning that Lincoln certainly knew this, but Jonas was a masterful political tactician, a great speaker, and the two men spent time together.
And you also write in the book that really Jonas was instrumental in urging and helping Lincoln to run for president.
Yes.
Tell that story.
So Jonas really is involved in Lincoln's politics really in the 1850s, and hosts one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which is held in Quincy, and afterwards, when Horace Greeley comes to Quincy and they are talking, Horace Greeley, a newspaper man and so on, and a significant politician, they are talking about who they might run in 1860, and they go through various names, and the claim is Jonas is the one who argues, what about Abraham Lincoln? And Jonas then constructs a strategy for the Republican Party, which actually becomes the party's strategy. We've got to attract outsiders. And fascinatingly, he includes among those outsiders not just German liberals, but Israelites, whom he feels the Republican Party can capture. Whether they did or not, the Republican Party has been trying to capture Israelites for 150 years, but whether they did or not is less interesting.
Yeah, we didn't have exit polls.
Yeah,
in the 1860s,
and less interesting than the fact that he writes this and talks about it. And there's little doubt that Jonas plays a role. And then at the convention, which is really astonishing, The convention is held in Chicago, in what they called the Wigwam in Chicago in 1860. And actually, lots of people in those days would try and pack the hall. And William Seward, who thinks that he has this nomination in the bag, has arranged to duplicate a lot of tickets so that his supporters will come in. They will make a tremendous demonstration.
And this is held in Chicago, another
Who knew,
stunning,
right? That never happened
revelation.
before, right?
Yeah.
So there's going to be a big demonstration for Seward that will convince everybody Seward is unstoppable. But of course, word gets out, and Jonas, who of course is supporting Lincoln, he says two can play that game. So he also makes lots of copies of the tickets, and he also packs the hall. And to everybody's surprise, when Lincoln's name is put into nomination, there's as big a racket as when Seward is. And if you read, you can go online and read the protocols of the 1860 Republican Convention, and you see the adjectives that attempt to describe these demonstrations, and it's clear that it's Lincoln and Seward, and that means to people in the convention, oh, Seward is not a sure thing. And Lincoln's strategy is, if Seward is not a sure thing, and then these other guys, Bates and others, they didn't get big demonstrations, so everyone will abandon their first love, and everybody's second love was Lincoln. So on the third ballot, Lincoln gets nominated. It was a very successful strategy, and that's how Lincoln gets the nomination, and Jonas, his friend, plays a role.
You know, you made a very interesting point when you talk about who were the Jews who came. I think a lot of us can trace our ancestry, those of us who are Jewish, to political dissidents or people who were persecuted for their political views. My grandfather, was a Bundist. Both of my grandfathers were Bundists in Eastern Europe. One was a Zionist who went to Palestine. And I bet many of the people here have similar stories, that we trace our ancestries to politically active people, which is one of the reasons why they were forced to leave, so that it's not a big surprise that there were at least some Jews, even that early, who saw politics as an important endeavor.
No question. I mean, another person who supports Lincoln, and is a name that we know, is Louis Dembitz. And people think I've left out the last name. No, Louis Dembitz was the uncle of Louis Dembitz Brandeis. He's another person. He happens to come from the area around Prague. Similarly, has had to leave in the 40s. Also is a Republican, actually is at the convention, and is very active politically, and will be remembered in Louisville, and he's also a polymath. He knows 12 languages. And this Louis Dembitz so impressed his nephew, Louis David Brandeis, that Louis David Brandeis changed his middle name for that uncle, and we know him as Louis Dembitz Brandeis. I have to mention Brandeis once in every appearance. It's in my contract. But
you've actually mentioned it about 6 times already, so you're way ahead.
I win. Well, but it's fascinating, really. And Dembitz, again, is one of these figures who is not sufficiently remembered, but he's so impressed with Lincoln that after Lincoln's assassinated, he names one of his children for Abraham Lincoln. Is really another example of one of these folks, liberal in Central Europe, involved in activities that get him thrown out, essentially, comes to America. Now, of course, that's not just a Jewish story. All sorts of people came to America because they got into trouble in their homeland, and America was the place where you came if you got into trouble.
Another character who plays a big role in your book, the archivist mentioned him, Zachary,
Zachary, yeah.
who was a foot doctor. You describe him as a chiropodist. I guess a podiatrist would be the modern word.
Right.
But talk about the role he plays, because he becomes kind of the secret emissary for Lincoln and helps free several Jews who were imprisoned in the South. I mean, this was a shadowy and fascinating character.
Fascinating. And Issachar Zachary has also come to America from England. The man did much to hide his background, and it's been hard to piece together, but he's very significant in the spread of chiropody, which is a kind of new medical area. The word chiropody is only invented in the late 18th century. It's only changed to podiatry in the 20th century because people got confused between chiropody and chiropractors, and so they thought they'd get more respect if they were called podiatrists. But in any case, now how Zachary trained is quite unclear. He claimed all sorts of background that cannot be true, but what...
Another shocker.
Never happened before. Self-invention was big in the 19th century.
Particularly when you came to America.
Right.
I mean, that was what part of the whole point.
Right.
You could reinvent yourself, right?
But what's fascinating about Zachary is he is a fabulous chiropodist. He does it in a painless way, and they survive hundreds of testimonials from people who say he treated us, and
including General Grant.
Right. So and including eventually Abraham Lincoln, no less than William Cullen Bryant, the poet and so on, recommends Zachary to Lincoln. And Bryant was a great walker and wrote at some length on the values of walking. And Zachary's made a big reputation in New York, and the idea seems to have been that there should be a chiropody corps for the soldiers. After all, their feet need tending. Now, you have to remember, in the 19th century, most people had very ill-fitting shoes. The notion of a right shoe and a left shoe had not really been developed. So try it. Reverse your shoes. You'll need a chiropodist too. And so foot problem.
In fact, the chiropodist union encourages you to do that.
Foot problems were ubiquitous, really, in the 19th century. And as many people know, Lincoln, for all sorts of reasons, had particularly painful feet. So Zachary comes to Washington, and he treats various senators, and he treats various generals, and he treats Abraham Lincoln's feet. And Lincoln takes time to write him a testimonial, and actually we have 3 different testimonials that Lincoln writes. It's just astonishing, and all of them very honest in a Lincoln way. How it will be, we shall see, Lincoln writes, which is not the way professors write about their graduate students when they recommend them for jobs. The fascinating, now it doesn't happen, the Surgeon General did not believe in chiropody, and even though Lincoln clearly wants to see a chiropody corps, the Surgeon General had the last word, and it doesn't happen. But instead, Lincoln sends Zachary off to New Orleans. New Orleans has just been liberated by the troops. Lincoln knows that there are significant numbers of Jews in New Orleans.
Starting with Judah Benjamin.
Exactly that. Judah Benjamin. There's a great line about Judah Benjamin. one of the senators said,
Secretary of Defense
Benjamin,
or Secretary of State of the Confederacy?
right, Benjamin is eventually rises to be Secretary of State of the Confederacy. Of course, he's left New Orleans for Richmond by this time, but his roots are in New Orleans, and there are Jews play a disproportionately significant role in the governance of Louisiana, and it's a big Jewish community. Anyway, I didn't mention this great line about Judah Benjamin. He was called on the floor of the Senate an Israelite with Egyptian principles. It's really a wonderful line that got a lot of notice at the time. But in any case, Lincoln sends a Zachary, and he writes that he thinks tells General Banks that Zachary will be useful, both because of his peculiar specialty, meaning his skills in treating foot problems, and also because of his ties to his countrymen. And that's really fascinating. Over and over again, Lincoln uses that word countrymen to describe Jews, even though they didn't have a country. He views them as an ethnos. In any case, we now know that Zachary, in New Orleans, he does a certain amount of spying and sends letters back. He has the idea that if he sends out spies dressed as Jewish peddlers, they'll be able to go in different places. So he does that. And he also tries hard to help various Jews who have gotten into trouble. Either they've been caught smuggling or
Because, as you pointed out, there are a lot of Jews who had settled in small towns throughout the South as peddlers. Outside of Charleston and New Orleans, the big port cities, there was a vast network of Jews, often in quite small towns,
and
ran small stores.
They would provide the goods. And in some ways, of course, before the Civil War, you'd have right here in Baltimore, you had a major distributor of goods. He would give these peddlers what we would call consignment, and they would go off and sell. And in a way, for most people, it was a stepping stone on the way up. It would allow you to accumulate capital. Eventually, you would open a store, and a few of those people would become Sears Roebuck.
And in New Orleans, virtually every large department store was Jewish-owned. I mean, the Newman family and the Godshaws, and very much
Riches, department store, all of those. The truth is that in the 19th century, especially in the South, the term the Jew's store was not a derogatory term at all. Indeed, communities were excited when such a store opened because that meant that you'd be able to get all sorts of goods, and it put you on the map and so on. In any case, our friend Zachary did all sorts of things. It is perfectly clear that he was one of a lot of people who thought he could bring peace between the North and the South, and General Banks had also various presidential ambitions that, of course, would have been helped had he and Zachary managed to pull this off. He had a secret meeting with Judah Benjamin, and again, note that Jewish connection. And of course, it doesn't come to anything, but there are a lot of people who Zachary seems to have helped. And we know that because I found an article in one of the Jewish papers that there is a dinner, huge, for Zachary in New York, and it is really a thank you from all of the people whom he helped. And they give him clearly a significant present. He got people out of jail. He kept some people from going to jail. He played an important
Including
role.
some people who probably should have stayed in jail.
No
Yeah.
question that there were people
blockade
who,
runners and people
right,
like yeah,
who
but
claimed that, I mean, and there's no question that Lincoln freed all sorts of people who claimed that they had been unjustly arrested and the like, when in fact it may have been a little different.
you know, these great characters that you've done such a wonderful job of describing, there's a larger concept here. You talk in the book about Lincoln's sense of inclusion with Jews and that he saw them as insiders, not outsiders. Step back and talk about sort of where that philosophy, you mentioned the personal relationships with someone like Jonas, obviously very important. You mentioned his biblical, the fact that the first Jews he ever met were biblical characters who he deeply admired, obviously. But talk about Lincoln's larger sense of how he thought about these individual Jews, but Jews as a people as well.
Yeah, my sense is that Lincoln looked at Jews and saw a connection in his mind to the persecuted slaves and blacks. To his mind, if we really believe in freedom, all men are created equal, then that had real meaning. And that's why he refuses to buy into know-nothing movement, because he feels it cuts against the anti-Catholicism, cuts against his views on blacks. And in the 19th century, in this period, much more than we realize, the persecution of blacks in America and the persecution of Jews in Europe are linked in the public mind. These are two persecuted peoples. And I was surprised, really, at how much evidence I found. So, for example, here in Washington, you had twice plays that Lincoln goes to that are on Jewish themes. One with the title Gamia is actually written by an African-American playwright, Séjour, and he's writing about the Mortara affair in Italy. A Jewish child is converted by his nursemaid against the child's will and is then removed from the child's home and brought up actually by the Pope in the church. It was a big issue in the middle of the 19th century, and it becomes a play. And what's fascinating is that many people go to that play but interpret it through the lens of see what happens to persecuted peoples. And then there's another play called Leah, which is about the persecution of Jews in Europe. And again, if you read the reviews, they understand this play about persecution of Jews to be an object lesson concerning the persecution of blacks. And when Lincoln is assassinated, there are many people who draw that connection, including Moses Montefiore, the greatest Jew of that time, from England, who says, Lincoln freed the slaves. I still wish that Jews would be freed throughout Eastern Europe. So that link is very much there. And I think in Lincoln's own mind, aiding persecuted peoples and treating them as equals was something he deeply believed in. So for him, having these Jewish friends is not different than befriending Frederick Douglass and so on. It was part of who he was and what he believed.
But it's also very striking, and of course we were here 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, talking about a previous book of yours, where General Grant, one among many of Lincoln's generals and advisors, who did not share his sense of inclusion and did not share his sense of respect. Grant issues the famous order you wrote the book about, General Order 11, which mandates the exclusion of Jews from the territory that Grant's armies occupy. and you document in this book a number of examples of anti-Semitic comments made by generals and others. In taking this inclusive view, Lincoln was swimming against a tide among some of his closest advisors and supporters.
Yeah, no question. It's easy to find kind of casual anti-Semitism among generals, among politicians. I mean, even if you compare Lincoln to his predecessor, James Buchanan, or his successor, Andrew Johnson, both men, if you read their private papers, make what we would call straight anti-Semitic comments about individuals who are Jewish. You don't find that in Lincoln. And there are, in the Lincoln papers, astonishing letters of people writing to him and blaming all of the problems on the Jews and urging him to distance Jews from America. That will solve all the problems. And he doesn't pay any attention, and you do not find, even in the private Lincoln, and there are 20,000 letters, and you can search them electronically, you won't find those kinds of comments. So he really was different from those around him.
In fact, you have one of the, and by the way, we should give credit to Benjamin Chappell, whose collection, private collection of these letters and documents forms the basis for the documentary part of this volume. And he's one of the papers that you have and quote in the book is after Lincoln countermands General Order 11, Grant's order to exclude the Jews. He gets a letter from one of his supporters saying, please tell me it's not true that Grant's order was justified, and he praises it and says, please reassure me that your revocation is not true. Well, of course, it was true.
It was true, and he called best order ever issued, and so on. And there is little doubt that just as lots of people were smuggling, it was easy to find Jews who smuggled, but there were plenty of people who only noticed the Jews who smuggled. And Lincoln didn't fall into that trap, and he specifically says, response to Grant, it's still timely advice that he doesn't like to see a whole class attacked on account of a few sinners. It was to his mind, we look at people as individuals. But I also do think that he had come to have a high regard for some Jews, and that's important.
And also, one of the things that I learned from the book was the detachment that you describe as the Jewish Company, that there in fact was a unit that fought at Gettysburg under the command of a Jewish general, Edward Solomon, that had over 100 casualties at Gettysburg. Tell the story of that unit, because I never knew about it before, and I bet a lot of people don't either.
Yeah, it was fascinating that in Chicago, the Jewish community actually collects a fair bit of money in order to recruit Jews, and this Jew company comes to be known, and again, should not be viewed as in a disparaging way. Under Edward Solomon becomes very significant and is particularly important in the Battle of Gettysburg, because they hold on to a particularly significant piece of land. Quite a few of them actually don't make it back, which was generally true. But Jews were very proud, I think, of their involvement in the Civil War. There's no question that Lincoln knows of their involvement, because when they write to Grant after this order, they point out, hey, we got a lot of soldiers here who are Jewish, including some in your own fighting force, which was also true. It was a man named Spiegel, whose relatives founded the Spiegel catalog, by the way, Poor Spiegel didn't make it through the war, but his relatives did, and they're still alive today. And
In Chicago. Yeah, it was Chicago family.
yeah, Spiegel Cadillac was in Chicago. There are others who are involved. Lincoln knew that. The Jewish community is very proud of it. There are probably 7,000 or 8,000 Jews who fight for the Union. And that again bespeaks the fact that you now have a significant Jewish community. 150,000 Jews is going to produce a certain number of soldiers.
And that helped lead, and Dr. Ferriero mentioned this, lead to one of the most interesting innovations during the war, which was the introduction of rabbis as chaplains, given the fact that you had a significant Jewish population among the fighting forces.
Yeah. Now, that's a very important story. It's a very kind of Washington story. When you first have chaplains, you got to make sure that we only get the right people as chaplains. So they write into the law that a chaplain has to be a minister of some Christian denomination. And of course, that means the Jews are legally second-class citizens here. Now, there were a lot of laws written at that time. It does not seem to have attracted much attention initially, but then the Jewish community not only notices it, but one of these Jewish companies, it doesn't happen to be the same one out of Chicago, actually elects a Jewish chaplain. His name was Michael Allen. He was not, he wasn't an ordained rabbi, although he had been a cantor and he was a Jewish lay leader. The company brought him in because they thought he'd be the best man as chaplain. But of course, once people realized, A, he's not a minister, and B, he's not a Christian, he has to resign. Now they do what we would call a test case. The same company says, okay, we're going to elect, in those days you elected chaplains in the Civil War, we're going to elect Arnold Fischel. He is a rabbi. In other words, he was the assistant rabbi at Cherith Israel, today known as the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue in New York. They elect him. And it goes up all the way to the Secretary of War, who has to embarrassingly write that, we would certainly have viewed this favorably. The man is much more competent than many of the people who served as chaplains in the Civil War, but he's not a minister of some Christian denomination, and so they can't legally appoint him. At this point, the Jewish community really decides to fight for its rights. It's the first major civil rights battle the Jews fight. They don't get far with Congress, but this man, Arnold Fischel, who has been turned down, he comes and meets Abraham Lincoln. And we have a whole description of it because he kept all of the documents and he had paved the way, and he goes to the White House. And although there were a lot of people who wanted to see Lincoln, Lincoln apparently knew who he was, and Lincoln tended also to privilege ministers and so on. He ushers him in, he studies the papers, and he agrees that something has to be done. And Lincoln then, I was writing this at the time of paralysis in government here in Washington. I said, wow, how different then. Lincoln decides, listen, Lincoln says something has to be done, but it's not easy to change a law. After how many congressmen are going to vote to change a law that celebrates Christianity? So they don't change the word. Instead, they decide that they're going to reinterpret the word. The official language is construe. So we are going to construe the word Christian minister, a minister of some Christian denomination, to mean minister of some religious denomination. And they write this language, and then they make sure, thanks to Lincoln, to bury it deep in a bill that gives raises to very popular generals. Who's going to vote against that?
Right.
So the bill passes, and then very, very quickly, a chaplain is recommended. Lincoln writes the president, his assistant president wants this done, and they approve him, and Jacob Frankel is made the first Jewish chaplain. That changes history because it means that the chaplaincy is not restricted just to the majority faith, but people of all faiths can be chaplains, as they can be to this day.
And it's a wonderful story because it reflects a larger point that's a theme of your book, that Lincoln changed in the course of his public life, that from using the trope that law embodied, that we are a Christian nation, and that Lincoln, in the course of his public life, very consciously changed his own language. In his second inaugural, he doesn't talk about a Christian nation, and that your view is that this was a reflection of this growing sense of the diversity of America, and including the role of non-Christians.
Right, and America is changing. Of course, it's very timely because, of course, it's changing in our day as well. But America is changing from an America that is overwhelmingly Christian. And in Lincoln's day, there are 150,000 who don't fit, at least, who are not Christian at all. And we see it in the Gettysburg Address. Jews and Christians have fallen in Gettysburg. So Lincoln invents this term, this nation under God. And it's
Doesn't
well...
say Christian God.
Right, it doesn't say, right, this Christian. Okay. And it's one can go online and read Edward Everett's endless address at Gettysburg, and it's all about, these Christian martyrs, forgetting Jews had fallen at Gettysburg. Lincoln, who of course was short and remembered, uses different language. And since Lincoln was criticized early in his presidency by Jews for some of his Christian references, it seems to me that he does consciously change his language. And just as he becomes sensitive, so we later see that America becomes sensitive to the presence of non-Christians and what that means.
And you also point out that, of course, we've just gone through the 150th anniversary here, and a lot of focus on the death of Lincoln. And Laura mentioned that one of the attending physicians was a Jewish doctor here in Washington, Charles Lieberman. But you also remind people that, yes, he was shot on Good Friday, but it was also Passover. And that since he died on a Saturday morning, many of the first eulogies delivered by clergy in America were delivered by rabbis because they were in the pulpit on Saturday morning.
We have many stories of rabbis, as the word spread, who, of course, had to just get up and eulogize Lincoln. And the papers were full of descriptions. At this synagogue, this happened. At this synagogue, they said Kaddish, never before said, but for someone of the Jewish faith. But suddenly, that seems appropriate to say the traditional Jewish memorial prayer for Abraham Lincoln. And it was noted at the time that many of the first eulogies were given by Jews. And it's extraordinarily important to Jews that they be part of this memorialization process. In New York, Rabbi Isaacs, the editor of the Jewish Messenger, the rabbi of Sharei Tefillah, at that time one of the senior rabbis in the city, eulogizes Lincoln along with others. Jews participate in many cities in the memorial process. And of course, we've just had the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's so-called last journey as he moves from Washington to Springfield. And if you look in many of those cities, say Cleveland and Springfield, you do see Jews involved. And that was clearly very important to them because it demonstrated that they were part of this country. It's not somebody else's country. They too feel that they want to eulogize and be part of the memorialization of this president.
And I get a sense from reading the book that in the same way that blacks long felt a special connection to Lincoln, that Jews have too. You mentioned at one point, I think it was a book that was published that described Lincoln as Rabbi Abraham. There is a street in Jerusalem named for Abraham Lincoln. And that there are many instances of Jewish writers and Jewish artists using Lincoln as a theme, and that he continues to reverberate in the Jewish consciousness, not just as a historical figure, but also as an inspiration for artistic work.
Yes, and I mean, Jude, there is, we just showed it for the first time in 10 years, there is a contemporary painting by the Jewish artist Carvalho, and it's really a fascinating painting. Lincoln, it uses the Diogenes theme. Diogenes, who is searching for an honest man, drops his lantern. He's found it, and that's Lincoln. But it also, and this is what is so fascinating about the painting, it introduces two themes that are going to be very important. This is an 1865 painting. One theme is the pairing of Washington and Lincoln. He has a little statue of Washington looking approvingly on Lincoln, and of course, they're going to be linked. Some of us remember when you'd have both Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday in February, similarly paired. And then he also includes those famous words from Lincoln's second inaugural in the painting, which is part of the elevation of the second elevation of the second inaugural, which when Lincoln delivered it, not everybody thought was so remarkable, but within a few months, it's going to become a sacred text.
You know, it's interesting because just a personal note, I had a very dear friend, have a very dear friend, was a college classmate of mine, named Joseph Russin, and his dad, Robert Russin, a well-known sculptor, did many statues of Lincoln, a Jewish man from New York, including one that sits at the highest point of the Lincoln Highway going west. And my friend Joe's younger brother is named Lincoln. I mean, here's just one example of a Jewish artist deeply devoted to Lincoln as a subject and as a spiritual and artistic inspiration. Right. And of course, down to the modern day of the Spielberg movie, Lincoln, this tradition of Jewish artists.
Lincoln Filene, people who remember Filene's Basement. Another example, someone named for Lincoln, and Lincoln Filene was full of liberal ideas, in part because he carried that name and thought that legacy was one that he should bear. It becomes enormously important. Solomon Schechter, remembered as a founder of the Jewish Theological Seminary and of the conservative movement in Judaism, has a wonderful essay on the meaning of Lincoln to him and how he first heard of Lincoln in Europe and how it influenced him. The idea that there was a country led by such a person. He, of course, had been born in Romania, which was led by someone quite different than Lincoln. And
still is.
Yeah, it hasn't changed. And what it meant. And the Lincoln motif it becomes central to American Jews. My good friend Gary Zola has actually done a book about Lincoln in Jewish memory. He's the one who discovered this remarkable sermon, which, by the way, was by Dembitz, who gave it, that they called him Rabbi Abraham. I'm seeing Frank Gilbert here in the first row. We're talking about his relatives, Brandeis and Dembitz and so on. the idea. There were people who tried to claim, and I still get email messages from people who insist if his name was Abraham, he must have been Jewish all along. This, of course, is rubbish, but it does suggest how Jews thought about Lincoln.
By the way, you can start to go to the microphones. One or two more questions for Professor Sarna, and then we'll get to your question. So we've got the microphones, as usual, here at the archives. But in fact, no one lesser than Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, perhaps the most famous American rabbi of the time, explicitly says he must have been Jewish in his ancestry, which, as you say, there's no basis in fact whatsoever except the spiritual one.
Yeah, but what's fascinating is that Jews have claimed for themselves those presidents of whom they were particularly fond. So when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was very well loved by Jews, the argument...
And very well advised by Jews, too.
Yeah, yes. But the argument was, he had all these Jewish advisors, that his real name was Roosevelt, and that, he must have been Jewish. More recently, the claim is Lyndon Johnson must have been Jewish, and so on. That tells you more about Jews.
I would have been more likely to believe it about Roosevelt.
It tells you more about Jews and who their favorites are than about any of those presidents. But it's fascinating.
And then there's this final note that Mrs. Lincoln is famous. We heard a lot about this in the anniversary of the death, that virtually the last thing that Abraham Lincoln ever said to her on the day before he died was this yearning to see Jerusalem before he died. And so in his own mind, there was, to the very end, this strong connection with that legacy.
And I take, there is a debate over whether that quote was made up by Mary afterwards, as she becomes so very religious in the wake of the assassination, or whether it's real. But it is worth remembering that because of the advent of steam, it's now much easier to go to the Holy Land. Seward has gone to the Holy Land in the 1850s. Ulysses S. Grant is going to go to the Holy Land. And, of course, Mark Twain is going to go, and Herman Melville. So it makes a lot of sense that a Lincoln would have thought that he would go to the Holy Land. And given Lincoln's deep religious questions, those people who were searching often would go there in the hope that in the Holy Land, in Jerusalem, they would find the answers. So it's certainly plausible that he might indeed have dreamed of going to Jerusalem after he stepped down.
Because one of the things you point out that we know, he was a man of deep faith, very learned in the Bible. And one of the first things he said was his first introduction to Jews came from his deep understanding of the Old Testament.
I mean, full of religious questions, and his second inaugural bespeaks, how could this happen? How could everyone read the same Bible and come to such different conclusions? But a man who was certainly a religious seeker, we might say, and those kinds of people wanted to go for answers to Jerusalem. So I don't consider it impossible, but it's one of those questions within the world of Lincoln scholars. Do we believe her or don't we believe her? And again, it tells you more about the scholar. We'll never know the answer.
Okay. Please, ma'am, you get the first question. I'll get back over here.
I just finished a film on Julius Rosenwald. Actually, I'll be in Boston next Wednesday night, but let me just fill in a couple things. His father, Samuel Rosenwald, came to America in the 1850s and married a Hammerschlag. Right. And they named their son Julius Rosenwald because of Julius Hammerschlag. And my understanding is, and it's in the film, that Hammerschlag clothed Lincoln were friendly with him, accompanied the body when it came back, sold memorials, and then the Rosenwald family settled when they came to Springfield across the street from Lincoln's home, Kitty Corner, which is now used by the Park Service. And then when Rosenwald was a young man, and the memorial was being established in Springfield, he sold medallions for it.
Right.
And then years later, when he helped establish over 5,000 schools for African Americans, on the wall was Lincoln, oftentimes Booker T. Washington, and Julius Rosenwald. And just to make a full circle, Spielberg was one of my funders.
Good.
Thank you, Aviva.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm a college student, and I have had for many years a deep interest in Jewish history. When I was in high school, I read American Judaism, A History, and reading your book was essential in inspiring me to develop the interest in Jewish history that I have today. And that interest in Jewish history, I have no doubt, will always be very important for me. I wanted to say thank you very much, Dr. Sarna, for the role that your writing played in my becoming the person that I am today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that comment, which I greatly appreciate. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Steve. I come from the land of Lincoln. I grew up in Chicago. And one of the first political names I ever knew, and there's a Washington connection, Mayor Daley chose the federal judges, which you know require Senate confirmation. And I think it was the first point of political sophistication that I realized that he chose or picked somebody named Abraham Lincoln Merovitz. And my thought was, how could that guy not get confirmed with that name? So that's my comment. And you know our license plate says taxation without representation. The license plate of Illinois is Land of Lincoln. People remember a license plate. That's sort of a merger of political activity. And the woman who was responsible for that, thinking up that license plate, since we're in Washington, D.C., is a Jewish woman named Sarah Shapiro. So I just wanted that to be part of the historic record. I grew
By
up
the
in
way, if this voice is familiar to you, this is Mark Plotkin, a very well-known commentator on local TV and radio.
Thank
Go ahead,
you,
Mark.
Steve. My question is, the Chicago, there are 300,000 Jews in Chicago today. How many Jews were in Chicago in 1860? And was there anybody who was prominent, who was a donor, political activist in the city of Chicago, who maybe the name still resides there?
So you had a couple of thousand Jews, I think, in Chicago in 1860. What's really interesting is that whereas in New York, the majority of Jews did not vote for Abraham Lincoln. They had business ties in the South. They were worried about the implications. You may have had German liberal Jews voting for Lincoln. Majority of Jews vote for the Democratic Party. And the same is true in Baltimore. Again, you have a small number who support the Republicans. People like Rabbi David Einhorn have to run for their life. But the big Orthodox congregation is overwhelmingly supporting the Democrats. But in Chicago, a very careful study was done, and it does appear that the majority of Chicago Jews did support the Republican Party. And I have that here. There is a very significant Jew named Greenebaum. There are several Greenebaum brothers who Lincoln knows. The Greenebaums actually were also close to Douglas, but they are very significant in early Chicago politics. And as I say, Chicago is also the place where Jews raise money to have this Jewish company in the Civil War. But you're certainly not going to get hundreds of thousands of Jews until the coming of East European Jews, and that's going to happen much later. But this is really the nucleus of the Chicago Jewish community as Chicago begins to grow. And then you're going to see some Jews move from Cincinnati, which had thought that it was going to become the biggest city and greatest city and of course, Chicago becomes what Cincinnati dreamed of becoming. And
Although Cincinnati does have a better baseball team. Yeah.
well, what happened is, of course, Cincinnati had invested heavily in
pitching.
canals, in canals and in water, and it saw itself as the gateway to the West. When the railroads came to the city fathers in Cincinnati, they thought the railroad was the stupidest invention they ever heard of. Why should somebody pay when the water is free?
They had a
So
river, yeah.
They refused to invest anything or encourage these railroads. And, of course, Chicago, which was tiny and unimportant, was happy to invest. And Chicago then becomes what Cincinnati thought it would be. And this is symbolized some years later than the Civil War when Isaac Mayer Wise's own son moves from Cincinnati to Chicago. And as he leaves, he's supposed to have said, "If I forget thee, O Cincinnati, let my right hand wither." But then he moved to Chicago. There.
Thanks, Mark. Go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Sarna, do you see any similarities or even noticeable differences between how Roosevelt was eulogized by American rabbis versus how Lincoln was eulogized by American rabbis?
It's a very good question. There are similarities. I haven't studied them. It would be a good paper to assign to students, but
That's what graduate students are for, Dr. Sarna, yeah.
The reason it's a very smart question is there is a big book by a man named Hertz, who was actually the brother of Chief Rabbi Joseph Hertz of England, who collected all of these sermons about Lincoln. And there's also a big book, very little read today, of all of the Jewish eulogies for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And in that sense, one could really sit and compare them. Jews were deeply indebted to Roosevelt, in part for what you said. He brought so many of them into the government at a time when everybody else was discriminating against Jews. And of course, Jews also thought that his actions had ended the Depression, which was so devastating in so many immigrant Jewish families. None of those themes are going to emerge in the eulogies of Lincoln. But in both cases, people thought that they were presidents at a time when America was fighting a truly righteous cause, the cause of the Union, the cause of fighting against Nazism. And in that sense, it's easy to see parallels in the words used. And as I said earlier, a few people go overboard and Judaize both men, but only glimmers and hints of that, as I recall it, in the Roosevelt book or the Lincoln book.
Thanks a lot. Please, go ahead, sir.
Oriole fan. I want to thank you very much as an armchair Civil War historian and of the Jewish people. This is sort of like a great place to be for me. So I do have a couple of questions. Number one, there was a rabbi, I believe from St. Louis, that I've read over the years that was very influential. He was the one that lobbied for the chaplain, I believe, and I thought he was the first Jewish chaplain. The fellow started the rabbi started Washington
No, the
College?
first Jewish chaplain is certainly Frankel, and the man who lobbied was Arnold Fischel, who was from New York. and then there were some other Jewish chaplains. One of them, I point out, was named Sarna, but he spelled it differently than me, E-R. I don't,
I'm just trying to think
I'm
of
not
his
sure who
name.
you might be thinking of,
Right.
but lots of good people came from
Yeah,
St.
he
Louis.
was-
Yeah.
The question was whether Lincoln was friends with him as well, because I read a lot about the fact that he came from St. Louis to lobby.
And one of the roles, Dr. Sarna was talking earlier about the Jewish merchants who then, in effect, franchised the Jew stores around the South. Many of them were headquarters in St. Louis, the ones who had the franchises in Tennessee and Kentucky and those areas. And if any of you are interested, there's a wonderful book called The Jew Store, written by the daughter of one of these merchants who worked for the St. Louis Jews. I recommend it highly. It's a wonderful book that gives you a real sense of the culture that Dr. Sarna was talking about in these small southern towns. Please go ahead.
Regarding that, the merchants in the Civil War, Order 11, I had also read over the years that some people believed that Grant did it for military reasons only, that he felt that the rebels were following these, I'll call them salesmen, peddlers, and that they were able to discover where the Union troops were. So I found that very interesting. So the question I have is, do you think President Grant could be, quote unquote, an anti-Semite at that time?
So you have to read my other book, When General Grant Expelled the Jews. I'm grateful to you for giving me the opportunity to mention it, where I go into great length, of course. My argument, although there is no doubt that there was smuggling, all sorts of people were smuggling. Some people only noticed Jews, but the question is why at that time there'd been talk of Jewish smuggling for a long time. Grant's own father cooks up a scheme with the Macs in Cincinnati, a significant firm of Jewish clothiers, and they are going to go to Ulysses and get a pass to move cotton east, and Grant's father was going to get 25% of the profits, and the Macs were going to get the rest of it. And of course, Ulysses S. Grant believes that the best way to end this war is not to move any cotton at all, and then the South will be starved and won't be able to continue fighting. So when he sees, wow, his own father is engaged in a smuggling scheme and with Jews, so he has a tantrum, and he then expels the Jews. In a sense, he expels the Jews rather than his father. And that's that has the advantage of explaining also the occasion, the moment when it happens. But it is important to point out that this becomes an issue in 1868 in the election. Grant apologizes. When does that happen in Jewish history? I don't remember Ferdinand and Isabella apologizing, or any, certainly no czar ever. Sorry about that pogrom. It was a big mistake. I don't think so.
Cossacks never apologized to my grandfather, I'll tell you that.
So that's, and as president, Grant bends over backwards to embrace Jews. He has a Jewish advisor. He appoints a lot of Jews. When Jews are persecuted, Grant speaks out. By the time Grant dies, the Jewish community has embraced him. And so that's really a story, Grant, of a man who repents and doesn't want to be remembered for General Order Number 11, so much so that he leaves it out of his memoir. I mean, he writes this huge, wonderful memoir, and it's not accident that it's not in his memoir. His son tells us that Frederick, who helped him, I asked my father, should we say something about General Order Number 11? He said, my father said, the less said about that, the better. But fascinatingly, if you read the memoir, less read, of his wife, Julia, she goes out of her way. You know, sometimes what husbands like to forget, their wives like to remember. She goes out of her way to mention General Order Number 11, which she characterizes as that obnoxious order. And I take that as another sign that Grant was embarrassed by this stain on his record and spent really the rest of his life, especially after 1868, those last decades, trying to change the record and proving he was not that kind of person. So, but you know, that's sort of the story of Grant. You get a rebuttal if you like.
And of course, Laura, I should remind everybody that Laura mentioned that incident of Grant appearing at the dedication of the synagogue here in Washington.
And that's
as
part
another
of that.
example.
I mean, that's real penance. He sat in the heat of Washington for 3 hours at the dedication of that synagogue. He's the first American president ever to go to a synagogue dedication. He also gave a donation, and a significant donation, to the building. So all of that is part of a Grant's project to improve his image. Yeah,
Sir,
thank you. Good.
Thanks for your question.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that Jews influenced some of Lincoln's political use of religious terms, under God and whatnot. You also mentioned that Lincoln was himself a deep thinker, seeker on religious matters. Is there any evidence that any of his Jewish friends or conversations with Jews influenced any of his sort of more personal religious thinking?
I'd love to find such evidence, but I'm not aware of any. Most of the Jews whom he knows are liberal Jews who are not, everyone knows they're Jewish, but they're not deeply religious. I do tell that one interesting story here about an Orthodox Jew. There is an amazing letter that Ben Chappell, who is a fabulous collector in terms of acquiring this material, understanding it, and seeing its significance, and he owns a letter in which the discussion is that a man named Levy, who turned out, Chemi Levy, who was the son-in-law of Rabbi Morris Rafal, the Orthodox rabbi of B'nai Jeshurun in New York, he applies for a job in a quartermaster job in the Army. And Lincoln writes, "We have not yet appointed a Hebrew." This is the first case of affirmative action, probably, in American Jewish history. And it shows that Lincoln believes that we ought to appoint a Hebrew. Now, actually, had appointed Hebrews, but he didn't know it. But Chemi Levy is an Orthodox Jew who's known as being a serious Jew, son-in-law of a rabbi, and so on. And Lincoln, in typical wordplay, says that he will be a faithful man, meaning faithful to the Union, but also a man of faith. And that's the only example I know of where we see him interacting with an Orthodox Jew. He, of course, then meets. I mean, various rabbis talk about particular meetings. Zold and Rafal had individual meetings with Lincoln, but it's hard to know that they influenced him, except that he treated them as men of the cloth whom he respected, and sometimes he would kind of tweak them a little bit. So on one occasion, a rabbi came, and it was one of these fast days that Lincoln called fast in the Civil War, and Lincoln met this rabbi who wanted help on something, and Lincoln said, well, why aren't you back in your congregation praying? And he said, well, I asked my assistant to lead the service so I could come and meet you. So Lincoln did what he wanted and said, now you can go back and do your own praying. So that was typical Lincoln in some ways.
Thank you.
Great story. Yes, sir.
I just want to make two comments. I'm involved with Civil War medicine, so I don't think we should get out of here without at least mentioning that Bernard Baruch's father was a Confederate Army surgeon, Simon Baruch. Most people do not know that, and in fact, he used to take Bernie to the battlefield when he was a kid. But the other comment is that I think it was Robert Rosen I heard speaking, who has written this book, The Jewish Confederates. But he was giving a talk at the Plum Street Temple in Cincinnati, and he's relating the story that you did about the Mack brothers. And he's going on and on about what bad guys these were and so forth and so on. And then at the end in the Q&A, somebody raises their hand and she says, well, I'm a descendant of one of those brothers.
Yeah.
I have a memory that happened here.
No, it's
When we were doing,
Right.
you were here before,
Right.
and you were talking about the Mack brothers. Someone in this
in
audience,
the audience
said that they
was
were
a
relatives.
descendant of.
I remember
there were a lot
that.
of descendants, and
Apparently,
I opened my book on Ulysses S. Grant with a similar story of how I got interested in Grant and so on. By the way, there were lots of doctors on both sides. It didn't take so much. To be a doctor in the Civil War often meant a few months of training. We shouldn't exaggerate what it meant on either side, but right, Simon Baruch had better training, but there were other Jewish doctors on both sides, and some of them, which also happened in later wars, after serving as medics in the Civil War, then they went to Europe and got real training.
Is that because they were not allowed into American medical schools?
Not in the 19th century, there was not discrimination yet, but there really wasn't medical schools in the way there'd be in the 20th century. America was not the place that trained great doctors. I mean, Lieberman trained in Germany. That's where the great physicians came from in the
Except
middle
for Johns
of the 19th
Hopkins,
century.
which was a medical school by then.
Right. It's not in the 1860s. I don't. Johns Hopkins is not around yet, as I recall it. We'll have to look it up.
We'll look it up.
All right. Someone else, I think.
I think I know the system here when they take the microphones down.
That's a hint. All right.
So anyway, thank you very much, Dr. Sarna.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Don't forget, Dr. Sarna will be out there. He'll be signing books, but we are not responsible for any orthopedic injuries. So pick up this book with two hands, but please do. It's a wonderful book. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. That's great.